This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Welcome to this episode of Roots and All, where I'm speaking with investigative journalist Carey Gillam about glyphosate, one of the most widely used herbicides in the world. Carey has spent years researching its impacts on health and the environment, as well as the discussions surrounding its regulation and use. She talks about her research, the science behind this particular herbicide, and the effects of the chemical on soils and our health.
I've been a journalist for a very, very long time. And I spent most of my career with Reuters, the international news agency, 17 years there. And then I moved on. I wrote a couple of books, and I work for The Guardian now. And I also manage a small news outlet called The New Lead that focuses on environmental news stories. I still do quite a bit of investigative work, and I do some consulting for documentary films. So when I started at Reuters, it was 1998, and they specifically hired me to cover Monsanto, which I'm sure most of your listeners are familiar with. And it was because Monsanto was really revolutionizing agriculture, and farming and the food that farmers were growing and how they grew it. And Monsanto had just rolled out these genetically engineered crops. And these crops were genetically engineered specifically to be used with these glyphosate herbicides. Monsanto, had introduced glyphosate in the 1970s. And so Roundup and Roundup Ready crops became the big thing in the world of agriculture, and expanded, of course, well outside the U.S. and has dominated agriculture in much of North and South America and other places around the world. So it was my job to, learn everything I could about this and the other companies that were playing in this industry, Dow, DuPont, Syngenta, BASF, and others. And so that's really what I've done for the last few decades is really dig deep into this agrochemical industry and what these pesticides mean for human and environmental health, as well as food and farming.
Would it be fair to say that you have focused on Roundup throughout your career?
Certainly, I became pretty well known because of that. I became one of maybe the only reporter or the very first reporters working for big news outlets to really start tracking the science and talking to scientists and others who were finding harm associated with glyphosate. Monsanto made this out to be, this is the best thing ever. It's so safe, and it's, safe for people and pets and doesn't harm the environment. And of course, our regulators in the US and other countries pretty much just went along with that. So, I started reporting on science showing harm to biodiversity and harm to the soil and, harm to people who were exposed to it. And Monsanto didn't like it, and it got me in a lot of trouble with them. But yeah, that's ultimately what my first book, Whitewash, was really all about, how Monsanto and US regulators had whitewashed this chemical and made it look so wonderful and so perfect, essentially covering up all of these risks that came along with it.
As you said, there are risks to the environment, to soil, to people and animals. One of the main things that gets spoken about is that Roundup was designated a probable human carcinogen. That's quite a almost vague statement. I don't think a lot of people understand what that actually means. And I think you covered that in the Monsanto papers, actually. Could you explain what that means in real terms?
This was a classification that came from the International Agency for Research on Cancer. IARC is the acronym. They're part of the World Health Organization. And this is a group of independent, very highly acclaimed international cancer scientists who come together to look at widely used substances to determine if they are carcinogenic or not. And they only do this after there is a kind of a large body of science and research that indicates that there could be an issue. And so they go and they look at these things, and they weigh them on epidemiology studies and toxicology studies and mechanistic studies. And they weight everything, and then they sift this all out and come up with this classification. And so they did determine that in looking at, what really are decades and decades of studies, that there was quite a lot of evidence. And they determined that when you weighed all this evidence, it was probably a human carcinogen with a specific link to non-Hodgkin lymphoma, which is a type of blood cancer. They did not find that it very definitively was. No, they don't. They only have determined, they're very careful in their weightings, and I have to look back here on their website to get the exact number, but it's only a very small number that they have said are definitely carcinogenic. They definitely are very conservative. But what happened when this classification was issued, and I believe this was March of 2015, the world went crazy, basically. Monsanto went crazy and said absolutely not. And they put out a campaign to try to delegitimize and harass and intimidate these scientists. And they demanded that this classification be revoked. And they sent talking points, as I talk about in my book. They sent talking points to the EPA, telling the EPA how it should respond and exactly what it should say, which was just one of many, many incidents that I was able to reveal in my book and my reporting through Freedom of Information Act requests that I had received. But they led the EPA by the nose, and European regulators as well, to a certain degree, to try to fight back against this classification. But like with anything else, there's a range of studies, and quite often, they find different things. And, in some of the studies, particularly in epidemiology, it can be very difficult to determine if a person's cancer is specifically tied to their exposure to one specific thing. Because, of course, as people, and particularly farmers, they're exposed quite often to a number of different things that potentially could cause them cancer, and they have different genetic backgrounds and that sort of thing, and different susceptibilities, different habits, lifestyle habits, whether they smoke or drink or spend a lot of time in the sun or, have other factors. So it is very difficult to very specifically and directly tie these chemicals that are so widely used to specific diseases in specific people. But these cancer scientists said the weight of evidence indicates that it probably is causing cancer in people.
And I presume that lifted the lid on kind of people bringing lawsuits against Monsanto. And I think probably a lot of people have seen in the news that there have been suits that have been brought and maybe actually have lost the thread of what's happening. But has anybody successfully sued Monsanto for causing their cancer?
Yes, so after that classification, you did see sort of an avalanche of people who had non-Hodgkin lymphoma who had used Roundup or other glyphosate products made by Monsanto. Ranger Pro is another one. These people did then file lawsuits. Over 100,000 people in the US. There are people in Australia and people in Canada and elsewhere that have filed lawsuits. The very first lawsuit went to trial in 2018. It was a man who was given a very short amount of time to live. He had an extensive exposure because he was a groundskeeper, and he had his spray truck had actually had a malfunction, and he basically was doused completely in the chemical and had lesions, just within months develop on his skin. It was a non-Hodgkin lymphoma that manifests in the surface of the skin, and it was quite awful, and was given a diagnosis of about 18 months to live. But he did win. The jury awarded him over $280 million after, appeals and subsequent time went by. That was cut down to about $20 million. But there have been other trials. Other people have won. There was a husband and wife that won $2 billion. That also was cut down on appeal. But there have been several wins for plaintiffs. There have been several wins for Monsanto as well as these trials continue. The company that bought Monsanto, Bayer, the German company, has paid out, we've lost track a little bit, but we know it's over $11 billion that they announced that they were paying out to settle as many of these cases as they could. But they still are ongoing. There was just one in Georgia. I think that it's going on this very week here in the US. So, this continues to be a real problem for Bayer, the owner of Monsanto. And currently in the US, what they're trying to do is to get laws passed in each state, as well as at our federal level, that would make it very difficult, if not impossible, for people to file these kinds of lawsuits against Monsanto or other pesticide companies.
And are there any countries globally that have outright banned the use of it?
Yes, numerous countries have moved to try to ban it. Several countries in Europe tried to ban it. At one point, France said that they were going to ban it. It very narrowly only was reapproved in Europe in 2017, and then there was another narrow reapproval. But every time that a country has moved to try, Mexico has tried to ban it, Thailand tried to ban it not too long ago. The company will, work its magic and get the US government and other allies behind it and threaten trade sanctions and all sorts of other things to try to bully these countries into continuing to allow the sale and the use of this chemical.
I don't suppose there's a person on the planet who isn't aware of the recent governmental change in the US. Has that affected how Monsanto's viewed, or has legislation changed around it in the US so that it becomes easier for it to be used?
Well, that is such an interesting question, really. We still need to wait and see. Now, when Donald Trump was president previously, before Joe Biden took office, there was a memo that we were able to obtain, which his White House administration basically said back to Monsanto, don't worry about glyphosate. We have your back on the glyphosate issue, which seems to indicate it doesn't matter, right? Don't worry. We're going to continue to allow this to be used. So we don't know what the new Trump administration, what their stance will be. We do know, of course, they're very friendly towards farm country and pesticide companies and all of that. But the unusual thing is we have Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who has come into the Trump circle and has been appointed head of Health and Human Resources in the US, that HHS does not have any regulation over pesticides per se, but Mr. Kennedy is a strict opponent to glyphosate. He was one of the lawyers actually in that first trial in which that groundskeeper won all that money, helping represent that groundskeeper. He is a staunch critic of glyphosate. So if he has any influence in the Trump administration with regard to that, we may see a pushback on glyphosate and other pesticides. It's too early to tell, though, now.
And to pick up on what you said, aside from the risk to humans, there's the risk to soil and the risk to animals. Thinking specifically about soil, what are the problems it causes with that?
Oh, my goodness. Glyphosate use really exploded because of the use of genetically engineered crops, right? It had been on the market since the 1970s and farmers were using it. But when you brought in genetically engineered crops that could tolerate being sprayed with it, farmers were then using it very differently, right? They're spraying it directly over growing crops in the warm months and the seasons, and they're irrigating and it's getting into the soil. And you had soil scientists who started studying this, and what they were finding was that this large amount of this use, because farmers could just use it ubiquitously, they didn't have to worry about killing their crops as they did before, that it was killing the microorganisms in the soil that make your soil healthy, that help make your plants healthy. So you were seeing less hardy plants, more susceptible to disease. Farmers are having to then spray maybe more fungicides or do other things. And the soil is just being depleted of its nutrients and all of these fungi that are so essential to, the soil is really sort of the beating heart, right, of our planet and our ecosystem. And when your soil is sick, everything else is sick. And you're not retaining water like you should, and there's runoff, and all of these chemicals are getting into the waterways. And it just created sort of this domino effect that was really just being very harmful to a whole range of elements of our environment. Our government scientists here in the US studying this late 2000s, early 2010, 2011, were putting out reports finding that glyphosate was now so ubiquitous in our environment that you were even finding it in rainfall samples. So it just is becoming impossible to escape. But yeah, the soil has been a real concern because of the overuse of this chemical and how it then creates a need to use other chemicals. The weeds are become resistant to glyphosate because it was used so much. So now farmers are using more and more of other chemicals. Other GMOs have been developed, dicamba-tolerant crops, 2,4-D tolerant crops. So farmers can now spray dicamba and 2,4-D directly on top. Sometimes they're doing glyphosate, dicamba, and 2,4-D. They're having to use maybe more paraquat on a burn down because it's this vicious cycle and this treadmill of let's use more and more pesticides because we're damaging the soil so much and the weeds have become resistant. It's not a good long-term solution, it doesn't seem.
No, and I think I read that we've just found our first glyphosate resistant weed in the UK. What is the significance of that?
Well, the experience of US farmers here has been quite difficult for them and quite expensive for them. I didn't really appreciate it until I was out in the fields with farmers and saying, here, look at these. These are resistant weeds. And some of these weeds, they're thick and they're tall, and this isn't something that is easy to eradicate. Cotton farmers in the US were having to hire, hand weeding again because this was the only way they could get it done. And it cost them, I think the estimate was well over $1 billion in costs that these farmers were having to endure because of the weed resistance. It just makes it really, really difficult and, of course, cuts down on crop yields. It's a very big deal for farmers. Now, and not to mention, if they can still control them with more and more pesticides, if they can still get some control from a dicamba and a glyphosate, or a 2,4-D, they're having to spend more money on these. So it hits them from a cost perspective and it hits them from a yield perspective.
And you spoke about the persistence of it and that we're finding it in watercourses and even in human urine. So the fact that it was found to be present in human urine was quite a change of tide for a lot of politicians, because I believe there were a group of them that got tested and it was found in their urine samples. But for kind of context, that sounds horrendous. But are there other chemicals that we might find in human urine that we think, okay, that's not so bad that that's there because there are all these other things as well, and that's just a kind of another problem?
Certainly, yes. I mean, it is not unusual. I mean, I think it's been pretty well reported that, the majority of human life on the planet has PFAS in their bodily serums, which, are synthetic chemicals that several of them, it's a class of thousands of chemicals that are used for industrial purposes largely. And several of these types of PFAS, have been found to be very harmful to human health. And that is a very big deal. And again, they've just been used so extensively for so many decades now that they're virtually impossible to escape. There was a recent study that found them even in the most remote areas of Antarctica, underneath the snow. It is almost impossible to escape these chemical exposures. Certainly, Monsanto always maintained that the fact that glyphosate was found so widely in human urine was actually a good thing because it meant it was being excreted rapidly through your body and wasn't really staying in and being absorbed into your tissues and your organs and that sort of thing. Now, there are several scientists and research that disputes that. But that has always been the perspective of the company that, if you're getting rid of it and excreting it, then don't worry about it.
I mean, one of the things that really sort of struck me reading your books was about the links between universities and educational bodies to these agrochemical companies. And I think that's quite apparent from reading your books that that's a practice that happens in the US. Is that a worldwide phenomenon?
It certainly does appear to be, yes. I mean, there's been quite a bit of evidence of researchers in the UK and throughout Europe and some in South America and other places. Definitely here in the US, we've been able to document, again, through getting emails and other communications that these groups tried to keep secret, that this was very much part of a playbook, was to enlist academics who appear not to be connected to the company, who appear to be independent, but to be secretly funneling money to them and secretly putting together presentations for them and ghostwriting columns or articles for them to publish in magazines or on websites and things like that. I mean, it's been very extensive. We have documents where they lay out the strategy. We're going to get these people and we want them to say these things. And, we don't want people to know that we're behind it, that kind of thing. And the check will be, the academics, if you funnel a check through this particular bank account or through this foundation, then I won't have to report it, that kind of thing. And that's the point, I guess, in my books and when I've spoken to people at conferences or whatever about this. I am not a scientist, and so I'm not going to ever say, yes, this causes multiple myeloma or non-Hodgkin lymphoma or this or that. I mean, I think people need to look at the research and look to the experts and hear what they say and determine that, and we should report that fairly and accurately. The part about the active deception and the active conversations that have gone on for years with these companies, Monsanto's sort of the poster child for it, but certainly we've seen it with a number of other large chemical companies and other industries as well. But actively trying to deceive the public, to manipulate regulators, to try to even hide things from regulators, to use third parties so that people will be impressed by these academics who look very smart and acclaimed and look like they're independent when they're really not. I mean, it's just wrong. That, to me, there's no gray area there. That is just wrong. And if these products were so safe, why would they need to engage in this type of manipulation and deception is always the question that I ask myself.
Yeah, indeed. So given that you've had a long-term involvement with these issues, are you hopeful that the tide is turning? Are you hopeful we might be able to find alternatives or reduce our reliance on glyphosate?
I certainly think, at least from what I see here in the US, and I would love to learn more about what's happening in Europe, but what we see here in the US is definitely a movement away from chemical agriculture or the intensity that we've had to more regenerative movement, more appreciation for the need to take care of the soil and for soil health and to protect the nutrient value in the plants and to protect biodiversity and to try to protect the health of our water and our air. We are at a tipping point or beyond a tipping point, perhaps. People like to say that it's way past time to recognize, the dangers that we're doing, not only to the environment, but to human health. I mean, childhood cancers are on the rise here in the US. We have just all of these chronic diseases. We have so many problems. And a steady, diet, if you will, of chronic exposure to these chemicals is certainly not helping. So I think people are more aware and engaged, but there are some very big, powerful corporate forces, obviously, that are working against that movement. So I'm not sure who's going to win out on that.
A huge thank you to Carey for taking the time to be on the podcast. I highly recommend you check out her books and her journalism. And thanks to you for listening. If you like this episode, I recommend you share it far and wide with anyone who needs to hear Carey's voice. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.